So, welcome everybody, and welcome Peter Fantke. We're very excited to have you come here to talk with us about UNEP SETAC Global Guidance for LCIA Indicators, Uncertainty and Beyond. At the beginning, I'd just like to encourage everybody to please send any questions that you will have for Peter that we will wait for at the end and ask him. I will gather those all together and present them to Peter at the end. So if you would send them to me, Holly Harris, as a private chat, I can coordinate that. And without further ado, I think I will let Peter share his screen.
Thanks, Holly.
Can
you let me try that. Where am I? Where am I?
If you go to the bottom, yeah, the share screen.
It's coming up right now.
Yes, it is. If you want to put it in presenter, yeah.
Here we go. Great.
Perfect.
Thanks, Holly, for inviting me today. And I guess I have roughly half an hour, more or less. Not sure I will take that long.
40 minutes.
40 minutes. That's perfect. Yeah. That's perfect.
Okay.
So the topic of today's talk is about, and I was invited to that kindly from Holly and the team, to talk about an ongoing activity from the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, and the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, SETAC, Life Cycle Initiative. So we have a flagship project that was started in 2013 on providing global guidance for environmental life cycle impact assessment indicators, and it is really a global consensus building effort for LCIA. So I'm giving a bit of detail on what the general project is about, why are we doing that, what are the main things that we are trying to accomplish here, and then I go in some details in some of the task forces that I'm involved in more detail here. So first, the motivation and goal of that project is that we have heard over the last years a lot of multinational companies and other stakeholders that really ask for a consensual set of environmental indicators. That is for being able to compare their results across studies, across models used, and to get kind of a common language. In addition, the European Commission started a pilot project around a product environmental footprint a couple of years back, and now is trying to streamline a broadly accepted set of indicators for this product environmental footprint activities. This goes also across economic sectors and industries, and they really try to also harmonize the several methods and models out there. So the UNEP SETAC Life Cycle Initiative on that side had long-term experience already with such type of consensus building activities. One example is just the human and ecotoxicity scientific consensus model USTOX that was initiated in 2002 and ended in the first version published in 2008. So based on that, the UNEP SETAC Life Cycle Initiative established one of its flagship projects around harmonizing and providing global guidance for really building consensus in existing and new life cycle impact assessment methods and indicators. So the main goals in that flagship project are really to identify, first of all, the best suited indicators. So here we have a vast set from 12 to 15 indicators that we can pick, and there were different criteria like what is the level of maturity, what is the level of environmental relevance, and other things that played a role here. Then, in addition to identifying the best suited indicators, develop scientifically sound methods to quantify these indicators. So of course, this should build as much as possible on existing methods, but if necessary, to also facilitate additional new scientific research method development. And the main outcome should be and will be in the end of next year to provide a full set of characterization factors with corresponding uncertainty and variability ranges that are tested and evaluated in several application cases for the most relevant indicators available in LCIA. So that is the overview of the whole flagship project, and the project scope is 5 years and started 2013 and will end hopefully end of 18. So here is an overview of the different steps that were taken. So the whole project started in let's say late 12, but actually early 13. 2015 it started with the scoping phase. Several workshops around the world have been established for different impact categories that I show in the next slide to really see, okay, what is it what we are after, what is it where we stand right now with the existing LCIA methods to address these indicators, and what is still to be done. So that was quite successful, and in that, in the scoping phase, actually various members of other societies and various experts from the individual sectors have been included in the whole consensus building process. And ever since, on my side, for instance, I'm deeply involved in the fine particulate matter indicator, so health impacts from fine particulate matter exposure, and I'm really in contact ever since with people from indoor air modeling, from atmospheric air pollution modeling, from epidemiology, for respiratory chemical impacts, and many things like that. So really we took in expertise from the various important fields for each individual indicator. So the phase 2 or step 2 of the consensus project is really the consensus finding process. That is where we actually develop new research to harmonize indicators, to screen existing models and methods out there where these indicators are already addressed, and other things. So this is really where we try to compile a set of harmonized characterization factors. The tip of the iceberg for the first part of the consensus finding phase was a Pelson workshop. That is a specific workshop format where between 50 and 100 international experts are invited 1 week to sit together in a specific, let's say, very remote hotel or other facility, and really to compile a set of recommendations. So the first Pelson workshop in the beginning of last year was held in Valencia in Spain, and we worked 1 week and came really up with preliminary recommendations for the initial set of indicators. The second phase of the consensus finding has started in late 16 and will be for the next 2 years. And end of 18, we will have the final Pelson workshop where we hopefully come up with final consolidated recommendations across all indicators considered. So this is basically the whole project overview. And the Pelson workshop participants here led by Professor Olivier Joliette from the University of Michigan and Dr. Ralph Frischknecht. Where is he? I cannot see him. Ah, here, over here on the right side, pretty much on the right side. And UNEP was also here. The representative was Jorens Miedai-Canals, and from SETAC the representative was Bruce Weigand here, more in the middle both. So this was part of the whole team in Valencia, and they were just sitting together, and then 1 week compiled a report that was just published a couple of weeks ago, and the link for the publication can be downloaded here. It is really the first set of preliminary indicators, volume 1, for the global guidance for LCIA impact assessment. So that was quite an experience, especially for me, since it was the first time for me that I was really part of such an activity. That was really great. We worked more or less 24/7 and everybody was exhausted, but it was just beautiful. That's really nice. So what were the indicators? So the first phase of the flagship project focused on climate change impacts, fine particulate matter health impacts, water use impacts, and land use impacts. In addition to addressing these 4 relatively mature indicators where a lot of experience was already at hand, and where we had a lot of experts that we could actually take into account in addition. In addition to that, we had a cross-cutting issues task force that was established to address issues that actually exist across indicators. Some of them were metrics. Which metrics should we take? For instance, if we address damage level impacts, let's say for human health. Spatial differentiation was discussed. What is a reporting format for spatial models? Uncertainty, where I am deeply also involved, was one of the task forces or groups looking at how is uncertainty currently addressed in LCIA models at all, and how is it reported? And I come to that a bit more specifically at the end of my presentation today. Other things were addressed like reference states, normalization, weighting, time frames, and something like that. So there was a lot and many people involved, And the brief overview of the preliminary recommendations can be seen here. For climate change, what I found most surprising was they recommend preliminarily that we should have two climate change impact categories now. One representing more the shorter-term impacts by some chemicals, and one representing more the long-term impacts of chemicals. Since these cannot be really put together into one indicator, they recommend to go for two distinct indicators now to more consistently and more comprehensively address climate change impacts in LCIA. For fine particulate matter, I go in the next 3 slides into that since I'm co-chairing this task force. So I step over that and go directly to the water use. And here, DALIs for malnutrition caused by the lack of water for irrigated food production is actually the indicator definition for that. And we had here built largely on the methods from Stefan Pfister on the one hand and on the Volker group on the other hand. For the land use, that is actually the one that took most of the time just for the development of a new harmonized indicator, and that is still in development. So the first part that they accomplished was they had come up with factors for global species loss representing more or less land use related impacts on biodiversity, but so far that is restricted for use only in a hotspot analysis and LCIA and not for comparative research, for example. So of course here further testing and development is really needed for additional land use types and for harmonizing the different aspects related to the land use. That seems to be an extremely complicated indicator here. So for fine particulate matter, together with Tom McCone and Olivier Joliette, I was mainly sharing the whole task force, and here we followed more or less the whole framework that was already used or established by a consensus building effort around Sebastian Humbert in 2011. And we start from the mass emitted to air, either of primary PM emitted directly or from precursor emissions that form secondary PM. We look into a time-integrated mass, so we have the usual fate factor that we use here and the exposure factor, and more specifically we updated a lot the intake fraction and the exposure response factor. What is new compared to existing methods in that? As for the intake fraction, what is really new is that the first time that I have seen it on my side at least, is that we integrate indoor and outdoor sources together with indoor and outdoor exposures. So typically we spend most of our time indoors, but indoor exposure for PM at least has never been included in any LCA so far. So this is why we developed more or less from scratch a mass balance framework where we really combine consistently indoor and outdoor emissions and indoor and outdoor exposures into the intake fraction metric. That is pretty new on my side, where we really consistently can account, for instance, LCA is global, it's a global assessment, where we can account now in the developing countries for the high background PM concentration indoors related to, for instance, wood stove combustion processes. What is also new, a really new thing, would be that we were facing problems around the exposure response curve. Currently, in most LCA methods and indicators, we use linear slopes. But for PM, we really had evidence over many years now of a strongly nonlinear dose-response curve. So the big challenge was how to consistently integrate that curve or combine that with outdoor emissions or outdoor exposures and indoor exposures. So we found a way of doing that, and now we can actually account for nonlinearities in the dose response in the PM impacts framework. That all will be published end of 2017, where we publish the whole model and make it freely available, so it will all be open source, and we will have a separate paper where we have the whole characterization factors that we recommend then from that task force published for PM. What is different in terms of, if you look at the global coverage? So we have not followed a spatial approach. That was a broad consensus that we would like to go for archetypes. Why is that, and what does it mean? We have archetypes that to distinguish between urban and rural areas, for instance, for outdoor exposure. And this is because rural exposure and urban air exposure is very, very different. It can be really up to 1.5 orders of magnitude difference in the exposure levels. That cannot be captured if we go with any spatial model which has not a resolution of at least 1 by 1 kilometer at the global scale. Such a thing for exposure in PM and LCA does not exist. So this is why we thought to capture variabilities between cities and to capture even larger variabilities between urban and rural areas, we went for archetype systems, which means we have dynamically calculated intake fractions for more than 3,500 different cities with more than 100,000 inhabitants per city at the global scale. And we have the parameterized subcontinental regions and continents from USTOX, so 16 global regions and 7 or 8 continents. And this we combined into a set of archetypes. Whenever somebody knows my PM emissions are in a specific city, we can directly use the intake fraction for that city and combine it with the dose response function. If somebody does not know in an LCA where the emission actually occurs, in which city, we have archetypes for a generic global default city or for different city sizes that are built on a regression based on these 3,500 cities. More or less the same thing we do with indoor emissions and indoor exposure, where we have different building types that we put into different archetypes, that somebody only needs to know what is my air exchange rate and number of people living in a specific room or in a specific building, and from that we can derive the respective intake fraction distributions. So this is how we did it. This is here a look on the different dose response functions that we used. So you just look at the big black dashed line. That is for total mortality, considering 5 different health endpoints. It's a total mortality dose response curve. So we see on the on the x-axis really the microgram per meter cube air of ambient concentration, where on the high end here on the right side we see actually studies. So this is an aggregated dose response function where several studies were incorporated to actually compute that function. On the high end, on the high dose, on the high PM background concentration side here on the right, on the top right, this is actually fed by studies with indoor air combustion. So here we have really the people having wood stove cooking in India, for example, in the rural areas where we have really high background levels of PM. On the lower end, we have, of course, combined all the outdoor air, all the ambient air pollution studies in the US and Europe and in other countries. So this is how that dose response function was constructed. Now, if we in LCA want to go for the marginal or for the average, depending whether we are after long-term or short-term impacts, we can define just the working point and provide both the average slope and the marginal slope for each working point of that along this dose response function here. It will take a bit more time later to apply that also to specific endpoints if you are after that, like for stroke, ischemic heart disease, lung cancer, and others. For now, we start with the total mortality that is compiling these 5 endpoints in one. So I find that quite exciting. So based on that, we really get a nice set of characterization factors for multiple cities in the world and whatnot. And these indicators for climate change, PM, land use, and water use have been tested in a rice case study. So we built a whole system of rice production and consumption, where rice cooking and rice production in rural India and no, I think it's rural. No, it's rural India. It's urban China, and also combination of production in US and consumption in Europe to also include some transport emissions here. So that rice case study was just a demonstrative case to evaluate and test the newly developed characterization factors and indicators that they really work. And the scope is really not, or the goal is not really to identify environmentally preferable regions or rice production systems, but just to test whether our impact assessment methods that we developed in the flagship project are consistent and can be applied in a classical or typical LCA settings. That was published last year under with Ralph Frischknecht driving the whole thing, and the rice case study system was really interesting because we use real data, although we do not make recommendations, but just want to evaluate what matters where. For PM, for example, the indoor air exposure matters a lot in the rural India case. It was actually dominating the entire impacts on human health. So ignoring the indoor settings and PM in any LCA would dramatically change the conclusion if PM impacts really dominate the LCA results, as an example. So So this was the exercise on that. On the cross-cutting issues, if you look beyond indicators, or actually if you look at things that matter across indicators, then uncertainty is one thing that is really super important. So together with ETH Zurich and others, we formed a small task force on looking at uncertainty, how it is addressed in LCIA currently, and what should we recommend as minimum requirement set for how uncertainty should be reported around characterization factors in LCIA. Obviously, not all indicators can be used to quantify fully uncertainty around characterization factors. However, we are about to establish a little bit of kind of a guidance of what are minimum requirements to actually allow a little bit of comparison. And why is that so important? It is important because different indicators come with different uncertainty ranges, different precision, different accuracy, but also different orders of magnitude around their variability. As an example, climate change impacts have typically very low uncertainty ranges compared to, for example, toxicity. Toxicity is perceived and is actually having much higher uncertainty. However, the toxicity midpoint is much closer to the actual environmentally relevant endpoint of human health, whereas for the climate change, a CO2 difference in the air, well, it's very far away from the actual endpoint of human health expressed, for instance, in disability-adjusted life years. So we are trying in that task force to accommodate a bit of discussion around what uncertainty actually means, and when high uncertainties are really high, and when are they just perceived as very high, and how should they be reported if variability is really high. For example, for toxicity, we have uncertainty ranges of 2 to 3 orders of magnitude around the factor, but we speak of variabilities of up to 16 orders of magnitude. That is more or less the same relationship as we find with climate change or PM impacts, where we have a factor 10 uncertainty more or less, or a factor 3 uncertainty, combined with a factor 10 of variability. So the relationship between variability and uncertainty is something we need to consider, and this is one of the aspects that we tried to address. How do we do that? We first try to screen currently developed LCIA methods. One global method is the LCIA Impact Method that was recently released, and Mark Heibrechts, as I remember correctly, will talk about some of the underlying method development in his recipe talk in 2 months here in that webinar series. Another global method that was just published was the Impact World Floods. And we investigated both methods, how uncertainty is actually reported around their characterization factors. Surprisingly, this came really to a surprise for me, uncertainty in LC Impact was discussed for really all impact categories, but for really almost no characterization factors, uncertainty ranges was given and provided. So people using characterization factors from that method will not be able to actually know what is significantly different or not, how much the uncertainties actually are or not. The same thing is for Impact World. I'm sorry, I have to go back here. For Impact World, the other new impact method, LCIA method, spatial variability was the only aspect that was considered quantitatively, but still the characterization factors do not come with any uncertainty ranges. So I think this reflects where we stand in terms of uncertainty. Everybody is aware that things are uncertain, but we are really failing to provide reliable uncertainty estimates for all our methods currently. And that is the same thing for all other LCIA methods currently. We also looked at ILTD, which is a global, it's a European consensus-based method, and still there is nothing around uncertainty. That is something we tried to change. And the first is that we looked into potential reasons why uncertainty is really not assessed. And then we had different references reporting different problems. Mostly, it's a lack of available uncertainty data. So we do not have distributions, for example, around input data. It takes just more time to collect additional data if uncertainty is not already reported. Information is incomplete and available only for some of the underlying flows or chemicals. And all this is really hampering the implementation and reporting of uncertainty, be it qualitatively even or even quantitatively. That was our first step to try to understand what the problem really is. The next step was, and still is, that we try to look into the underlying models that are used for the indicator compilation in each method. For example, USTOX model that is used for human toxicity and freshwater ecotoxicity impacts. And we look into the publications of the underlying models and see whether they have considered uncertainty, and if so, what the details are around that. Do they have variability considered? And if so, how? Temporal, spatial, other aspects. Do they include parameter uncertainty? And if so, based on what? Do they use measured data, correlations, external models, or just expert guesses or something like that? Do they include model uncertainty, value choices, scenarios, what types of uncertainty methods they actually use? So do they use analytical methods like Taylor series expansion, or do they use more numerical methods like Monte Carlo, or do they only perform a sensitivity analysis as the least thing around some input parameters and other things? So this is an overview that is still ongoing, and here of course we are relying on the model developers to provide us with additional information, because not everything we can just squeeze out of the publications so far. Finally, I'm almost at the end here. We are currently also in the analysis of trying to go now really indicator by indicator and get in contact with the original authors of the underlying methods and try to understand what is actually possible in terms of qualitatively or even quantitatively express and report uncertainty from a specific model for a specific indicator. So going from where they actually stand to what is what they think would be actually possible in terms of reporting uncertainty. And the preliminary findings from that exercise are so far that we believe, and we came to an agreement in the working group, that we should make all uncertainties explicit, at least in a qualitative way, and we should identify and highlight the most relevant contributions, be it input parameters, be it model choices or values or scenarios or whatever. So as for input data uncertainty, we need to also include the uncertainty of external model data. An example is if you use for a specific LCIA indicator, be it climate change, a black box model that is outside really the LCIA modeling. So it could be an atmospheric climate model or whatever. The uncertainty should be propagated from that model into the LCIA results. Expert guesses should be labeled as much as we can so that we see, okay, this is the first part that we should approach or address to refine, to find more accurate data than just expert guesses. As for model uncertainty, we should make explicit what models we have selected and why, what the actual model system boundaries are, what assumptions are behind different models, and what types of model simplifications have been made. Variability is very important, should always be reported separately from uncertainty. It is a big part of uncertainty, but keeping it separate gives us an understanding of what is the variability, for example, across chemicals versus what is the uncertainty for one chemical characterization factor. So aggregation of results over time and space typically are given and should be reported, and the aggregation of substances and use types of substances also should be indicated. For value choices, it's clear that we have various choices that we can make. Some methods actually have that even explicitly included, like recipe. So here's a geographical scope, the time horizon, discounting, if at all applied in LCIA results, weighting factors, thresholds, and other things should be made explicit and at least qualitatively described. And finally, scenario uncertainty. Of course, if we have missing information that cannot be quantified at all, this should be also at least indicated. This helps to understand a bit the magnitude at least and the contribution of different aspects to the overall uncertainty of characterization factors, and that in the end helps, of course, to get a grip on how different results are between LCA, between products, but also between LCA studies, and to understand a bit, okay, how relevant these uncertainties are in relation to making a decision from that. One example, this is my almost last slide here, yeah. One example how we try that for the fine particle matter is how to integrate uncertainty here. So if we look back into our archetypes, let's say we have a global average city we have a lot of assumptions for the global average city. It has a wide uncertainty range from left to right, just qualitatively indicated here. It is a single value in the middle, but we report an uncertainty range around that value that is very broad because we have a lot of simplifying assumptions for a global average city, of course. If you go to the third level on the bottom here, we see, let's say, it could be characterization factors or intake fractions for individual cities. So each one comes with a much smaller distribution with a much smaller range of uncertainty around each central value. And that means we have taken out completely the across city, the intra-urban variability that is included in the top level here, where we really look at 3,500 cities and include the variability in the uncertainty estimate of the single global average city. In the bottom here, where we have individual cities, all this variability is taken out, and what remains is the uncertainty specifically for that city. So really related to the city parameters and to the chemical parameters in that sense for PM. This is the way we try to make it transparent, also the way of how we aggregate something into an average value, be it a spatially average or time average or whatever. This can actually be further detailed also in the report published by the UNEP SETAC Leipzig initiative earlier this year and can be found under this link here. So the timeline from now on is that we continue with the overview of existing uncertainty approaches for use in LCA, specifically focusing on LCIA, since this is the scope of the flagship project. But of course, LCIA is not the only component in LCA, and we also need to actually combine with other working groups and get together with other existing working groups around uncertainty in LCA, where they look at the life cycle inventory, where they look at the interpretation and the scenario development, functional unit definition, and so on. We are currently also in the process of listing all relevant uncertainty aspects that should be considered in LCA, as you have seen in the previous slides. And we are then trying at the end of this year, more or less in fall, we are trying to draft recommendations of consistently addressing uncertainty in LCIA. We start with that. And then we have also a link to another task force that is the interpretation task force, where we look also into uncertainty related to normalization, monetization, weighting, and other aspects. So how by end of the flagship project in mid-2018, we will have a set of guidance principles to address uncertainty in LCIA available and published that can really be used and as a starting point for developing more quantitative methods for addressing uncertainty in LCIA. My final slide is really to come back to the overall project's benefits and the next steps. So the benefits would really be that we try to provide from the project a sound progress and take momentum toward global guidance on the development of harmonized LCI indicators. What is really important, this flagship project does not and will not provide a new method. So this is not about providing a new LCIA method that we recommend, but to update existing indicators that can ideally then, or will be ideally integrated in existing methods in their updates or by others who will develop the new LCIA method. But the flagship project aims at just consistently looking at individual indicators and cross-cutting issues, but will not provide in the end a method which is a separate UNEP SETAC method. This will not happen, at least not to my knowledge. With all that, what is then the purpose, if not creating a new method? The purpose is really to increase the credibility of existing LCIA indicators. And that can partly be achieved by developing science, but partly only by creating additionally scientific consensus wherever the science will not help anymore to improve an existing indicator quantification. The newly established task forces end of last year that we are working with now, in addition to climate change, fine particulate matter, land use and water use, are acidification and eutrophication, mainly related to effects of ecotoxicity. The human toxicity was also addressed separately, so it's really about chemicals. Use tox addresses, for example, the whole environmental emissions. but what came up in the last 2-3 years through various working groups in the world was really the whole consumer exposure, occupational exposure, how to integrate that with environmental exposure, how to bring that consistently together, how to look at those response more specifically for the various types of chemicals. What about new databases, like in Europe, the REACH database and all that. So there's a lot of things to do for the human toxicity task force. I'm chairing that task force together with Tom McCone from UC Berkeley and Professor Olga Joliet from University of Michigan. And we have just started that with a scoping workshop last year in fall, and we will be happy if anybody will contribute to that. Natural resources was another newly established task force right now, and ecosystem services finally. So we have 8 indicators that we address in that flagship project for now, and hopefully come up with global guidance in the end of the project. This was it from my side for now, for introducing that. I think this was 36 minutes for now, and I'm happy. If any party is interested, please contact me or go to the Pelston Workshop report that is here listed on 2 pages via a web link, and just contact the project chairs.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. That was quite a lot of work that was put together, and I'm sure we all appreciate you moving the ball forward on this. If you would be so kind as to put up the page that you were just referencing so that people could copy it down should they'd like to. And I would like to encourage any of our listeners. We have quite a few questions, but I'm happy to take more. So if anybody would like to if anyone has any more questions for Peter, please send them to me, Holly Harris, the host, and we will move on to the first question I have for you. Peter, can you please explain again how the PM characterization factors take into account the 2 slopes that you showed?
Yeah, it's actually not 2 slopes. It's you mean how we take the marginal or the average slope? Well, that is relatively simple. We just define the working point from our exposure estimates in the model. Let's say if we have an exposure estimate of 50 microgram per meter cube, and we have an intake fraction of related, let's say 38 ppm, we combine that and find the working point on the dashed black line here of the intake fraction. So this dose response here is translated into an intake fraction based exposure and not based on the background ambient PM. So once we have done that, we can apply the marginal slope at that working point for an intake fraction of, for example, 38 ppm. And in addition, we provide a dose response slope for that is based on a marginal assumption here for that working point. And in addition, we provide a slope also based on the average assumption here. This means we will provide 2 sets of characterization factors, one based on the marginal slope and one based on the average slope, both for the same intake fractions. And this we do for indoor and outdoor exposures in a consistent way. And the first preliminary set of characterization factors for global averages is published in that report that you see here referenced on the bottom of the page. So you can look into details for how this is done, and actually you will find 2 sets of indicators, of characterization factors, one based on the marginal slope and one based on the average slope. Let me know if I did not answer any of the questions. So then just ask again. Can you still hear me?
Oh, I'm sorry, I had muted myself.
Okay.
Yes, that person said thank you, and they appreciate what your answer. And I'm moving on to question number 2, which is, Peter, right now tools cannot use nonlinear characterization factors. Do you have any thoughts around what ideally should be done to address that in the future?
I'm not sure that the characterization factors are somewhat nonlinear. What we provide is a simple tool, which is not a numerical tool, but it's a parameterized simple tool where we can consider nonlinearity in a dose response. With that, we still provide characterization factors for that specific response. So if you just enter a new value for an emission, we can directly give you the characterization factor in our Excel model that we will provide and make open access. I'm not sure that I understand then the question if this is something else that was asked. I mean, characterization factors that are spatial, for me, is nothing different than characterization factors that can consider dynamics in the nonlinear dose response, for example. The only thing that you would need is you would need to have some background, and the background is actually given on our side for all different exposure levels. So there's nothing that you need to provide in addition. The question is what of that needs to be in the inventory, but I think for now, if we have the PM emissions, primary or secondary precursor emissions, that is sufficient to know to actually get your two sets of characterization factors. This is the reason why it took also so long to develop that. We tried to really provide the background concentrations for each archetype that we provide, be it, for example, all 3,500 cities. We also try to provide the background mortality rate in each city and in each region that we consider. And this is, we did that by combining the city-specific intake fractions with the global burden of disease, mortality regions, and also DALI per mortality case background incidence rates. So combining this together consistently and especially, how's it called, joining that, these different data sets helped us to provide the whole background information that we can actually come with a parameterized set of characterization factors for any level of emissions that the practitioner provides. I hope that answers that.
I believe this is a follow-up question to that. She writes, so you are handling characterization outside the traditional LCA tools like CIMA-Pro and Gabi?
No, I think our characterization factors should ideally, of course, also be incorporated there. The question, I understand it a bit better now, is probably then, okay, we are supposedly will just provide two sets of factors, one for the marginal and one for the average slope for an emission unit. What you are saying is that the emission unit is not the only thing that needs to be reported in a life cycle inventory. If you want to use the characterization factors in CIMA-Pro or Gabi, for example, what you need to know is also what is your background exposure, for example. And that I agree with, and that is handled in the cross-cutting issues task force. To be honest, I actually need to ask them how they want to address that, because we are not the only ones who try to go that way. So there must be a way that they handle that. I think I will write down that question for me and see that we address properly what are additional reporting requirements for life cycle inventories in order to apply our characterization factors.
Okay, thank you. How does this work tie into the uncertainty road mapping effort?
Yeah, I'm in contact with the people of the uncertainty road mapping effort. As far as I have seen, they have slightly different things done and aiming also a little bit for slightly different things. On the uncertainty side, we are not trying to do so much new research, which I see that the road mapping working group is doing a lot. They really look into the life cycle inventory, into the equipment database and other things. And they look into case studies, how some companies incorporate and address the uncertainty on their side if they do an LCA. This is what I have seen so far. And we are trying to rather streamline and outline, okay, what is actually there and what should be done ideally, and maybe even how it can be done. But we will not do the research ourselves within the flagship project. So ideally, we combine our efforts with the uncertainty roadmap working group and other working groups, as I indicated earlier, and see how we can streamline our efforts in order to minimize overlaps and also to see how we can build actually synergies.
Okay. How does the uncertainty at characterization fit into uncertainty at damage?
Yeah, this is a big discussed issue. I recall that. There are several common beliefs about that uncertainty is higher at damage level and other things. And here, this is really this is something that we find important, that we figure out how to describe where on an impact pathway the actually midpoint lies. That influences dramatically how the uncertainty of a midpoint versus an endpoint can be or should be interpreted. So we will not quantify so far how midpoint and endpoint or damage level indicators in terms of uncertainty can be compared, but we outline and give some incentives of how they should be actually addressed. So if you have a midpoint uncertainty that is very low and an endpoint uncertainty that is very high, that can be partly due to that the midpoint is very far from the actual endpoint. So that the whole part is not actually addressed in the midpoint. That means that does not mean that the midpoint is recommended, because the endpoint is much more environmentally relevant, which also needs to be considered in addition to simply taking the uncertainty range around the factor. And that is often not done. So these are the things we are trying to discuss and address also in providing the guidance.
Okay, thank you. What is happening in the normalization and weighting uncertainty discussion?
Yeah, what is happening there? We have our first meeting, I believe, in 2 weeks with Alexis Laurent, my colleague, and Massimo Pizzo. These are the two chairs of the weighting and normalization task force. I need to check with them, and I have not have the status update on that. But it's clear that we need to align our effort for looking at the impact pathway and then see how can we make it consistent with what they are actually doing on the normalization and weighting. But I have no further information on that yet.
Okay. Is there any work happening in species migration that is an issue in hydroelectric and wind energy production?
Yeah. Species migration is I cannot say whether it's addressed because I'm not involved in that area, but I know that Francesca Veronis is looking into the ecological, in the ecotoxicity, not ecotoxicity, in the actual biodiversity. So she's looking into that, and there are people like Andrew Henderson, Leo Postuma, and others are involved as well on that. You would need to ask her, but you find that information really who covers what in the report that you find here on the bottom of the page again. Here you will see actually who is contributing to which parts in the report. And this, as for species migration, I would ask the people who really work with the ecosystems and the biodiversity so far.
Okay. When will the intake fractions and characterization factors for fine particulate matter be ready for use in LCA, and can they be adapted to be used also for other than the 3,500 included cities?
Yes. So the first question is, when are they ready? The intake fractions are ready. We are currently in the beta testing phase of that, so we are applying that to different actual cases and with reported data and testing that. That seems okay. What took long is still to define the indoor archetypes. So this will come most likely. I'm almost really certain about that. This will come in a couple of months from now. So still within 2017 we will have that published. I cannot say that for the characterization factors because that involves a little bit more work on the dose response, but I believe that it's not, latest will be March next year, because there we need to come up with the final recommendations. So hopefully within a year from now we have everything published and ready for use in LCA and also to be implemented in Gavi and CIMA Pro. For the second question, that was the biggest part of the work actually, to not only use the 3,500 cities with pre-calculated intake fractions, but to come up with a nice model that can be used based on population and city area very simply to adapt to any city of the world. So you can make a regression based on that with subcontinent specific intercepts. The slope is actually the same across continents. And you can just apply that regression to any of your cities that you desire. So that was actually the intention, because often for PM specifically you have a power plant specifically georeferenced location data, so you know actually in which area it lies. You just need to define whether it's an urban or rural area, and then you can apply our regression to specify your city.
Okay. Will the new human toxicity near-field elements be implemented also in USETACs?
Yeah, now I'm not speaking as an associate professor. Now I'm speaking as a USETACs manager. We don't know. We hope that the task force will, of course, make a proposal that this will be implemented in USTOX, but then it needs to be, I mean, we have a formal procedure in USTOX that includes an internal and also an external UNEP guided review process. Once a proposal has been made for updating something into USTOX, be it new chemicals, be it a new method, be it a new compartment or whatever, and it also applies for what we do here in the Global Flagship Project. So ideally, we anticipate to integrate the near field consistently with the far field that is currently covered in USTOX and propose it as an update towards the new USTOX version in 2 years from now or something.
Okay. Is anyone thinking of using an approach like the pedigree matrix for characterization factors?
I have applied something very similar like the pedigree matrix for pesticide characterization factors for crop residues a couple of years ago. It was also published in UNEP, but it's a bit more delicate. The pedigree matrix is really a semi-quantitative approach, and what we are after in LCIA, we have for many indicators a possibility to actually quantify uncertainty. I'm not so sure that using a pedigree approach is really the most straightforward point there. But this is maybe a function of what impact category we are looking at. So I have seen people considering that, discussing that, but I'm not sure this is something that we should or could recommend across impact categories.
Okay. If there are different task forces for particulate matter, human toxicity and ecotoxicity, how do you ensure that these indicators are consistent?
Yeah. First of all, because I'm involved in all of them for exactly that reason, to make to ensure consistency across that. So the PM task force was chaired by Tom Cohn. I was just invited as co-chair because I'm chairing the human toxicity. Michael Hauschild, my colleague, is coordinating the ecotoxicity and just invited me as a contributor to that to maintain a kind of consistency and to build consistency. The fate part for toxicity is actually already consistent in USTOX across human and ecotoxicity. However, there are things we need to discuss for one or the other working group to see how we update that. For PM and toxicity, it's more challenging. In the PM task force, we already tried to harmonize that with USTOX. For instance, going for an average city of 2 million people, how does it comply with the average intake fraction across the 3,500 cities, and all that. We really try to streamline and harmonize that to ideally make it very easy to compare all this later. But it's an effort that has to be made separately, so this is a cross-cutting aspect across these 3 task forces.
Okay. Will there be a new LCIA method based on the guidance project results?
No, as I just said at the end of my presentation, the aim of that flagship project is not to develop a new LCIA method, but to come up with improved indicators to make them harmonize between each other, and ideally they can be used to be implemented in updating existing or creating new methods. But there will not be a UNEP SETAC recommended LCIA method based on that project.
Okay. One more question. How is uncertainty considered in the existing results from the UNEP SETAC guidance project?
Yeah, that is different between the different indicators. So in climate change, it's done differently than for particulate matter. I can so far speak just for the particulate matter, where I have shown in one of the last slides here how we aim at reporting uncertainty ranges, including variability around the characterization factors for PM, for different scenarios, for different cities, for different indoor archetypes, and so on. And that will be done differently in different indicators. So every task force tries to go for the highest possible level of reporting uncertainty around their indicators or around their characterization factors and results, but that is really as a function of the maturity and the available approaches for quantifying each indicator, of course. So the level of reporting of uncertainty differs between indicators, but we aim as high as we can.
Well, Peter, I want to thank you for a very enlightening project that you've shared with us today and for all this cutting-edge work. It's very impressive, and we wish you the best of luck in your continuing efforts here, and thank you so much for this presentation for us.
Yeah, thanks everybody for listening. Thanks Holly for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present that. And please just drop me an email or contact any other person from the flagship project if you feel you should be involved. We are really happy.
And I want to just remind everybody that if you missed part of this or want to review it again, this will be on our website. You can download the webinar and review it again, or have your friends share it. And I'd like to invite everybody to our next webinar, which is quite a different topic, happening on Tuesday, March 28th with B. Bocalandro, whose topic is Your Employees Need Something Unexpected. Purpose. So we encourage you all to join, and with that, I wish everybody a happy Valentine's Day, and don't forget to tell the ones you love that you love them. So thank you and goodbye. I will end the webinar now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.